Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E, como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Hey, history fans. If you enjoy shows like Pax Britannica, then you'll love Airwave History Plus, now available on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to ad-free listening to Pax Britannica, plus bonus content and early episodes from dozens of the most popular history podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, the Explorers Podcast, the History of World War II, the History of China, the Pirate History Podcast, the American Revolution Podcast, the Age of Napoleon, and more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for Pax Britannica and hit subscribe, or search Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 37. The Western Design. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, let me welcome the new members of the House of Lords. Andrew Tebb, Marquess of Southampton, Mark Lemke, Earl of Mercia, Jonah Beale, Earl of Hereford, Scott Stewart, Earl of the Western Marches, Jerome Renaud, Earl of Caithness, Timothy Whitton, Earl of Dorset, Ethan Skews, Earl of Widdicombe, and Noam Baron Schechner. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Last time, we saw the first Protectorate Parliament crash and burn. In spite of the clear wording of the instrument of government, the Commonwealth's men, true believers in the Republic, repeatedly tried to bend or break the limits of Parliament's authority, particularly in matters of religious freedom, which was a passion of Oliver Cromwell. Lord Protector Cromwell was so incensed that he used a legal loophole to shave off a couple of weeks from the minimum sitting of Parliament, just so he could dissolve it sooner. His first experience with parliaments, from a similar position as the executed Charles I, had not been a pleasant one. But in the middle of the life of the doomed Protectorate Parliament, a fleet set sail. It was the largest fleet assembled since the end of the Dutch War, with 38 warships, along with supporting vessels. The expedition had been planned with as much secrecy as possible. Not that you could really hide dozens of warships or an army of 2,500 men, but what was it all for? No one knew. Ambassadors could offer nothing to their continental masters, other than this expedition was destined for somewhere more tropical than England, which still leaves quite a few possibilities. This mystery included the crews and soldiers which had boarded the ships. Even the officers of the expedition only had a very vague idea. No one knew their destination. Where were they going? It was only once the fleet was at sea, safely out of reach of any foreign or royalist spies, that the target of the expedition was told to the men who would carry it out. They were aimed right at the heart of the Spanish West Indies. They were the vanguard of a holy war against the Habsburg Empire. If the Pope was held up by Spanish gold, then the English would cut off their supply. And if that could, instead, flow into the English treasury, then so much the better. This was the Western design. The origins of the Western design were partly ideological and partly practical. On the practical side, as the war with the Netherlands was winding down, this left the Protector with a powerful military with nothing to use it for. His army was among the best in Europe, and his navy had just proved itself against the Dutch. It would be a shame to do nothing with them, not to mention expensive. On the ideological side of things, Cromwell and those around him were absolutely convinced that England as the most powerful Protestant country, ought to take the fight to the two major bulwarks of Catholicism, the two crowns, France and Spain. Both were currently fighting each other, and Cromwell was quite happy to play them off against each other. The States Navy had intervened in the siege of Dunkirk to help the Spanish, for example. Neither France nor Spain relished the idea of renewed war with the English. Spain dreaded the renewal of the Anglo-Dutch alliance, which would seriously threaten their colonial holdings. And the French really didn't want the States Navy prowling their Atlantic coastline from their bases in the Channel. Cardinal Mazarin, Louis XIV's chief minister, was very aware of the danger, and in 1652 he sent an ambassador to London to try and remind the English that their real enemy had always been Spain. National heroes like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh had taken the war to the Spanish, bringing gold and glory to England and Protestantism. Spain had sent the armadas. Spain had backed Bloody Mary. More than this generational rivalry, Spanish America was vulnerable, so the ambassador said, and especially in the Caribbean. The French were aided in their diplomatic efforts by the testimony of Thomas Gage. So who was Thomas Gage? Born to a Catholic recusant family, Gage was sent to a French seminary around the age of 12. He travelled on to Spain and joined the Dominican order, leading to his father to disown him. He'd intended for Thomas to become a Jesuit. Now Tomás de Santa Maria, Gage's travels were far from over. He was so curious about the New World that he defied Spanish restrictions against Englishmen and smuggled his way onto a ship in Cadiz, bound for Mexico. His original plan was to cross the colony to the Pacific and then take a ship further west to Manila in the Philippines. But instead, he stayed in America, specifically in Guatemala, and he stayed for about 10 years. It seems that it was during this stay and his extended contact with the Pocoman Maya that his Catholic faith was shaken. In January 1637, Gage began his journey back to Europe. After getting robbed by Dutch pirates, he took the position of chaplain on a ship bound for Spain. He visited England and then went on to Rome, and then returned to England once again in around 1640. Now, by 1642, Gage had rejected Catholicism, and with the zealotry of a convert, became a hotter sort of Protestant. He was welcomed by the Long Parliament, which gave him a parish in Kent, where he would write his memoirs. The English American, his travel by sea and land, or A New Survey of the West Indias, was published in 1648 and dedicated to Sir Thomas Fairfax. Nothing like a bit of blatant flattery to help advance your career. This was a groundbreaking work. Gage was the first Englishman to write about his lived experience in Spanish America. I'll quote from Paul Lay's Providence Lost here. Quote, "Food is something of an obsession with Gage, due no doubt to the long periods of privation he endured. He describes, for the first time in English, classic Mexican dishes, such as burritos, which they dip in water and salt with a little bruised chili, and tamales, and writes movingly and sympathetically of the Indians who prepared them. He appears to have discovered that the Pocoman Maya placed poisonous toads in fermented drinks used for ritual intoxication, thereby increasing their potency. An entire chapter of his book is devoted to chocolate, quote, which they minister in great cups as big as will hold above a pint." He was fascinated by the dark, viscous concoction, though he observed, presciently, that "those who use this chocolate much grow fat and corpulent by it." End quote. Throughout the English American, Gage is scathing about Spanish rule and Catholicism in general, and he became a passionate defender and promoter of the Protectorate in print. In 1654, he submitted a paper to John Thurlow, Cromwell's Secretary of State, and his spymaster. In this report, he describes how the Spanish propped up the papacy with American gold, and if their colonies could be captured, quote, "Rome's triple crown would soon fall and decay." End quote. Mixed in with these more strategic points were Gage's own criticisms of the Spanish and Catholics in general. It's full of the black legend, and Gage describes how indigenous people suffered under the encomienda system. But he also insists that conquering Spanish America would be easy. Quote, "The Spaniards cannot oppose much, being a lazy, sinful people, feeding like beasts upon their lusts, and upon the fat of the land, and never trained up to wars." End quote. He particularly pointed to the Spanish West Indies as the weak underbelly of their colonial empire. Thurlow presented this report to Cromwell, and it clearly helped influence his decision. There were other factors which favoured the Protectorate attacking Spain instead of France. Religiously, though both were Catholic, France's church was particularly independent of Rome, whereas Spain and Rome were seen by the English as hand in hand. Attacking France would benefit Spain, and so benefit Rome. Befriending France would bring benefits. It would bar the exiled Stuarts from a powerful neighbour, and avoid the chance of any French support for Scottish rebels. So, in a meeting of the Council of State in April 1654, the councillors and the Protector discussed an Indian expedition. Fresh on the heels of peace with the Dutch, the council was, more or less, decided on an attack on Spanish America. But where? Hispaniola was the first Spanish colony in the Caribbean, but losing it to the English would be more than just bad optics. It was the administrative centre of the Spanish West Indies. It was believed to be perfect for English settlement, and it was ideally placed to threaten the Spanish treasure fleet. But there was also the larger island of Cuba. The councillors floated the idea of an invasion of a mainland viceroyalty, maybe Mexico, with its gold mines and suffering indigenous population. Panama, where Peruvian silver was trucked to sail to Europe in the treasure fleets? Why not just cut out the middleman and sail around South America and invade Peru itself? Gage had also painted a picture of a Guatemala which was ready and waiting for liberators to join their fight. Now, some of these ideas are clearly more practical than others. The Lord Protector took advice from another Englishman with useful experience, Thomas Modiford. Now, if that name rings a bell, it should. He popped up in our last episodes on Barbados as a rebel against the royalist governor. Now he was back in England, and he made two very important suggestions. The first was, wherever the Western design was going to attack, the island of Barbados should be used as a staging post. Secondly, that this expedition would live or die, quite literally, based on its planning. He warned the Protector that tropical diseases would be the biggest killer, that plenty of salted meat should be sent along with the force, that the fleet should carry enough drinking water, and that soldiers should be dressed properly for the climate. This was all very useful advice, but if you remember our interview with Carla Pestana, not all of it will be taken on board. The discussion was tabled until the summer. In the meantime, the Council sent orders to the Admiralty to prepare 14 ships for what they vaguely called the Western Design. But as preparations continue, that number would grow. When the Council of State met on the 20th of July 1654, the Western Design was front and centre. Here, Cromwell and John Lambert seemed to heavily disagree on the benefits of this expedition. The record of this meeting comes from Edward Montagu, the future Earl of Sandwich, and he wasn't taking minutes, but recording it after the fact. According to Montagu, Cromwell saw this as an opportunity from God. Here was England, its domestic enemies defeated, more or less, with victory abroad, and its armies and navy honed into a powerful fighting force. Quote, "God has not brought us hither where we are, but to consider the work that we may do in the world as well as at home." End quote. Providence, God's will, was all. More than that, in terms of foreign relations, the Commonwealth could not just sit passively. To ward off attack, it must appear dangerous, it must strike first. Lambert was less providential than his friend, and in hindsight, quite a bit more realistic. How well defended were the Spanish colonies? How successful could an expedition across the Atlantic be? What about the armies already in the field, garrisoning Ireland and Scotland? How many people would really be interested in moving to conquered Spanish territory? How would this all be paid for? But Cromwell would not be diverted. Won over by the religious arguments of Gage and the tactical advice of Modiford, the Lord Protector was utterly convinced that God supported this endeavour. To once again quote Lay, "These were the words of a man who had never known military defeat."
Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia, mas na Zendesk nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
By the start of July, the preparations for the Western Design had now expanded to include 36 ships for the actual expedition across the Atlantic, with 24 ships reserved for Robert Blake's command in Europe. In a coordinated strike, as soon as word reached England of the success of the Western Design, Blake would lead this fleet to blockade Cadiz. With their main naval port sealed, the Spanish would be unable to send any help to their colonies, and the dominoes would fall. The leadership of the main force was also decided. William Penn would command the fleet, and Robert Venables would command the land forces. Penn, a distinguished veteran of the Dutch War, was appointed to the Western Design on the 18th of August 1654. Venables was also a veteran, and he had fought in both the First English Civil War as well as in Ireland, fighting at Rathmines against the Marquis of Ormond, and then accompanying Cromwell in the savage reconquest of Ireland. Cromwell was full of praise for him, but Venables had never felt sufficiently rewarded for his efforts, in a tangible, monetary way. He saw the offer of command in the Western Design as a long-deserved promotion. His wife, Elizabeth, was to come along with him. They'd only just married, and who doesn't want a honeymoon in the Caribbean? But by December 1654, they still didn't have a specific target. Penn was issued orders to attack Spanish shipping, and Venables was told to, quote, gain an interest in that part of the West Indies in the possession of the Spaniard, and given 3 possible approaches: to conquer Hispaniola, to conquer Cartagena in Colombia, or to do both, taking Hispaniola and then moving on to the mainland. The Western Design was not left solely in the hands of Penn and Venables. They were part of a 5-man commission, and the 3 other men were there to provide oversight and to establish the first stones of a government in the conquered lands. These were Edward Winslow, Daniel Searle, and Captain Gregory Butler. We'll see much of these men throughout the Western Design, so let's introduce them now. First, Edward Winslow. And actually, we've seen him before, a long time ago. Winslow was one of the Pilgrims of the Mayflower, and one of the first governors of Plymouth, Massachusetts. Paul Lay calls him John Thurlow's eyes and ears. He was reliable, and he was experienced with both sea travel and indigenous peoples. We've also met Daniel Searle before, but only briefly. He'd been appointed governor of Barbados by the Commonwealth fleet once they'd suppressed the colony after the regicide. His main job would be to manage the politics in Barbados and help recruit reinforcements from among the colonists. The final member of the commission was Captain Gregory Butler, who was sent ahead to the island of St. Kitts to gather additional supplies and recruit local guides who knew the Spanish colonies well. The standing orders of the expedition forbade any looting or plunder. Spanish property in any conquered land was to be seized for the use of the state, whereas indigenous peoples were to be actively courted as allies. In one key sense, the preparation for the Western design was an overwhelming success: its secrecy. The Protectorate obviously couldn't hide the fact they were preparing an expedition, but any specific details about its target were kept hidden from prying eyes. And there were a lot of prying eyes. Royalist spies reported that the mustard ships were being reinforced against tropical worms. To them, this meant the Caribbean. Madrid was also well aware that the English were doing something, and that they were the likely target. But where? Where would the English hit? The West Indies? Rio de la Plata? Madagascar? Manila? The problem with having a colonial empire on the scale of Spain was that it presented many possible targets for attack. Penn set sail on Christmas Day 1654, leading a force of 38 warships carrying 2,500 men. The Western design was officially a go, and the courts of Europe waited for news. And that is where we will leave the Western design today. Next time, we will see the expedition reach Barbados, and then turn to its target, the island of Hispaniola. Thank you for listening to this episode of Pax Britannica. There's been a slight gap between episodes, because I've been juggling quite a few projects. One of those is finally starting. Winds of Change, my new podcast on the end of the British Empire. The first season is on British India, and the first episode, The East India Company, is now available on whichever podcast app you're using right now. Just search Winds of Change. It's the show with the British flag against the sunset. It's very poetic, I know. Since this episode is almost over, why not go and listen to it right now? Go ahead, I'll wait. Welcome back. How was it? Amazing, fantastic, a tour de force? Or maybe you subscribed or queued it up for later? Or maybe you sat in silence for a few seconds? Either way, every single listener helps new podcasts get off the ground, especially for independent creators like me. So please do search for Winds of Change in your favourite podcast app and give it a listen. Some of that first episode will be familiar to long-time listeners of PAX, but most of it will be new. What's also new is the format. It's more of an audio documentary, complete with expert guests and voiced sources. As the first season of Winds of Change releases over the next 12 weeks, it will take up most of my time. There's a reason these sorts of podcasts often have massive budgets and teams of people working on them, instead of just one guy. I am super proud of the work I've put into Winds of Change, but don't worry, PAX isn't going anywhere. Thank you to my House of Lords, the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Damien, Duke of Portland, Bruce Simmons, Marquis of Argyll, and John Watson, Earl of Hillary. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Have you ever gazed in wonder at the Great Pyramid? Have you marvelled at the golden face of Tutankhamun, or admired the delicate features of Queen Nefertiti? If you have, you'll probably like the History of Egypt podcast. Every week, we explore tales of this ancient culture. The History of Egypt is available wherever you get your podcasting fix. Come, let me introduce you to the world of ancient Egypt.